Hello, everybody. My name is Rick McCutcheon. I'm a Dynamics 365 MVP, and I'm here today on this European Shipping Forum presentation brought to you by NMB Solutions and MS Dynamics World. We're going to be talking today about supply chain compliance, how it's evolving, so don't get left behind. So let's get started by introducing our speakers for today, and we'll go to Stefan first.
Hi there, everybody. I'm Stefan Tarneberg. I'm Senior Directors, Enterprise Solution Consultants at E2Open. Been working with in the compliance world for over 23 years. Background in freight forwarding also, and IT solutions for that within the 23 years.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. Phil.
Hi, my name's Phil Stubbington from Henley Ridge Management Consulting. We're a logistics and supply chain consulting company focused on digital transformation for logistics and supply chain.
Okay, thank you. Chris.
Hi, everyone. Chris Winstanley, Vice President of Solutions Management at NMB. And in my role, I engage with customers, partners and prospects to consult on their shipping and compliance needs, and then support within NMB the sales and implementation teams to make sure our services add value to our customers.
Okay, so let's get started. We're going to start with you, Phil. Our first question. Over the last couple of years, organizations went through some tough times with disruptions in the global supply chain. This is due to the outbreak of the war in the Ukraine, the pandemic, and a few other things that happened over that time. What are some of the challenges of handling exports and imports to multiple countries?
Thanks, Rick. Obviously, with the war in Ukraine and with Russia, it's impacted a lot of things. Obviously, some parts of the world are much more dependent on imports of oil, like most of Europe, and gas than other parts of the world. And obviously, there have been a number of restrictions put on both Russia as a country and individuals associated with Russia that have impacted supply chains. And obviously, it's got a knock-on impact in terms of cost of fuel, particularly in the maritime sector as well.
Okay. Would you like to add anything, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things really, that kind of two competing factors. So kind of almost taking it on a wider view than just kind of what's happening with Ukraine recently. But one is the increased globalization of the supply chain. So not just in terms of the kind of customers that people are dealing with, but because of the sheer number of disruptions and unpredictable nature of supply chain, it's effectively forced manufacturers and shippers to add resilience to their supply chain by looking on a wider scale, to look for alternative vendors in different countries and geographies. But at the same time, there's tighter controls on the imports and exports and who we can trade with and where. So you've got this weird scenario where on the one hand, globalization of your supply chain is absolutely essential, but is absolutely very tightly controlled. Can just give one example. So if you think of kind of the direction that Phil went in, so compliance was really essentially a linear process where you'd cross-reference products and shipments with published prohibited lists. But now if you think of the sanctions for Russian oligarchs, for example, you have to make sure that you're not doing business with any company that's at least 50% owned by the individuals. So it's a much more complex task of trying to disentangle the ownership structures within these international organizations.
Okay, thanks. Stefan, what would you like to add?
Well, Chris hit the point pretty straightforward here. I think the complexity around restricted parties and how to be able to ship goods today is more restricted than before. And we have seen that over the last 2 years now, where sanction list has come out to the market. It's hard to gather all the necessary data to have full control over who you're doing business with and if you can do business with them, based on ownership, based on where the company is situated. Even if the company is situated in US, it could be that an oligarch is on the sanction list who has the ownership of it. So it gives a complexity into the world of trade that everybody needs to take into consideration when they do business today. And that's where we are with everything around supply chain, because that restricts how you can handle the supply chain for your business.
So this becomes a very complex problem. So what are the impacts of geopolitics on the supply chain and getting proper compliance? And we'll start with you, Chris.
Well, I think Stefan and Phil and their long experience will be able to give you lots of examples and stories of kind of what the ramifications are. I think on the whole, people recognize that kind of recent events in Ukraine or China, for example, have an impact on compliance and sanctions and embargoes because it's all in the news. But maybe people aren't necessarily aware of the sheer scale of it. So if you think worldwide, there's around 700 plus published lists. And within that, I think it's something around 25,000 entities were added or updated in the last 12 months. So, and that's just for denied parties with your due diligence screening. And then, so if you bear in mind also that we're talking about, so far we've talked about restricted or denied party screening. So who you can trade with. Businesses also need to be mindful of what goods they can export to different geographies. So license determination comes into play as well. So determining whether you need a specific license to send certain goods or technologies to different countries based on end use and that sort of thing. So really, I think kind of when it comes down to the impact, the wider audience understands that kind of there is an impact. They see it in the news, but not necessarily the sheer scale and complexity of what goes into then ensuring that you are compliant with the rules and regulations.
Okay, thanks. Stefan, what would you like to add when we're talking about geopolitics and the supply chain?
So from a trading perspective, it's pretty interesting to read the news these days when you look into what's happening. And there was a couple of published articles around why is the export of washing machines so much higher to neighboring country to Russia, for instance. And then you say washing machine, that's not a military goods. Well, if you look inside a washing machine, there is a lot of parts that can be utilized within that. So it's not only what we say direct goods of military goods that can be affecting us in the trade. It can be washing machines, it can be electronic machines, or anything around that could be utilized for a country like Russia to put into their technical structures of military goods in the end use of that. And that puts also perspective into the geopolitics. Where do you ship your goods to? If I ship it to Kazakhstan, well, this new company in Kazakhstan is ordering 2,000 washing machines. Where is the end use of that? That's a question that you need to really think of. I had another company who was doing 3D printers. They were selling to an American company, but they were shipping to Poland. And they got like, why are we shipping that complex of 3D printer to Poland where the buyer is in US? And they started looking into the company in US and found out after digging some way of ownership, they found out that this was an oligarch and he was really connected to the military in Russia. So they were trying to send it to Poland, but they said, the 3D printer company said, we're not sending that goods into Poland, even if Poland is inside the EU. So it is a complexity in geopolitics when you look at the trade today.
Okay, thank you. Phil, what else would you like to add to this?
Yeah, just to build on what Stefan has said, really, there's some very, I don't know whether you describe them as odd cases out there, but it's not just things like washing machines. It could be a ball bearing that might be to a particular specification that is being exported somewhere, or one that we've come across recently, ceramic cloth, which is able to withstand quite high temperatures, which has military uses. And it's the sort of thing that feels quite banal, but there's still export controls around something like that to certain parts of the world. And also things like spare parts. So, using the washing machine example, it may be something that is supposedly labelled as a spare part in a washing machine that may be subject to export controls rather than the entire machine.
So this kind of leads us to what are the different options for screening? Stefan, what would you like to talk about?
Well, as I say, everything needs to be screened, even emails. Who are you sending an email to with a drawing of a specific product? That nobody knows that, but emails today is one of the thresholds where companies don't think of. But if you attach a document or a drawing of a specific product in there, that's when you are doing the wrong things. So what I say is that everything needs to be screened, but as I say, it could be a student coming into your factory or a student group. They need to be screened, and that could be what I call an ad hoc screening of those coming into your facility to verify who's coming, where they're from, and then get that information back and check them from that. And then the other part is verifying the transactional, the sales order or the shipments going out. And sometimes you have lead times from the sales order is verified until the shipment is going out. And maybe on the shipment, there is an area where you're shipping it to where you shouldn't be shipping that type of goods, but that's added on to the shipment in a very late process of your whole supply chain. And that's what we call the transactional verification of the data that you're sending out for that. And of course, then you have your standard, what I call regression tests on your existing parties in your ERP system, where a new list comes in or a new sanction list is populated by EU or anybody else, that you need to verify your existing clients. Even if they've been a good client for very long, there could be changes to them, there could be a change in ownership of them, and that's the regression test that you need to do. So there are 3 different areas: ad hoc, transactional, and regression. That's what you need to have in your organization.
Sounds like a lot of responsibility. Phil, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I would also add to what Stefan's saying that, of course, the other option when it comes to screening is to do it all manually. And funny enough, I was talking to a client just last week, and they were saying it takes our customs compliance team 5 days to screen everything. It's because they're doing everything entirely manually. And also, Stefan said, because of what people are trying to do to avoid customs compliance, they might be operating under a false name. They might be setting up a shell company in some part of the world that, how on earth would you necessarily know about that unless you're doing some automated screening against these compliance lists?
Okay, thanks. Chris, would you like to add anything?
So, Stefan reminded me of something actually. So we've really seen an increase in interest on what we're terming as corporate screening. So the concept of screening your employees, your visitors, students come into a facility. So that's something that's come into the mix as much as the screening for trading parties and items. So that's a really interesting point. And then to pick up on what Phil was saying, we really come across businesses that do all different combinations. I suppose so there's the manual option where you're effectively trawling through search lists, maybe going to websites, entering the data manually. And I think that's okay, up to a certain point. It depends on kind of how many trading partners you have, how many items you're shipping. Then there's options for outsourcing, so that you effectively push all that onto a third party. But then that you need to just be wary of sharing sensitive data with other parties, and when you do that. And then Phil mentioned automated screening, and that's really obviously one of the most effective ways of doing it, because it becomes part of your business process. So you're screening, that's using software solutions that automate the process of comparing the customer, the supplier, the partner information against the lists, and bringing back alerts or warnings on potential matches. I think where you ultimately end up is in some sort of hybrid, to be honest, where you have the automated process that's going on in terms of your trading parties, whether it's vendors or customers, and your items, and then maybe ad hoc for as Stefan referred to, ad hoc screening. So for doing that, and we find that tipping point from an NMB perspective is where customers want to move from a manual process to a more automated process. Or they're moving from one ERP to another and want to replicate a process that they have. And if I could just add kind of an extra thought to that. So we've talked about it purely from from the screening perspective in terms of the regulations and the way the world is evolving in that sense. But I guess we should be mindful about the way supply chain software solutions and technologies themselves are evolving. So that there is the ability to have that solution that becomes part of an ERP environment and be called as a separate service from other applications. So it really does give people a kind of more flexibility and a more future-ready solution, which is something that I think, as we talked about, the speed of change becomes more important.
So I think the next question is probably the most important question we can ask. What are the responsibilities and obligations of an importer or exporter for the screening of partners, customers, and countries? And what are the consequences and misconceptions about restricted party screening? And let's start with you, Stefan.
Well, I would say from a legal perspective, depending on what country you sit in, there are different rules and regulations from a legal perspective on country level. And from that perspective, I would say I wouldn't trade if I wasn't secure on my compliance perspective. And that means the whole compliance perspective, because every trade is regulated in some way. And if you have a small part in your product that is manufactured in a country where the laws are pretty long-armed, so to say, from a restricted party screening, you can get a pretty high fine. And that's everything from emails that are consisted of drawings of a military usage or possible to use for military usage, or even a construction that could be utilized further on in the chain of production for that. So yes, there are obligations, and from a security perspective and risk perspective, I wouldn't jeopardize my business without doing restricted party screening, because I don't want to have, I have talked to companies who even have their own bank account where they put money off the shelf for securing that they can pay the fines if they miss something in their supply chain and risk assessments of that. And that's not a good way forward. You should at least keep your information in-house and secure your risk management for the supply chain, including the compliance perspective of that. And fines can be everything from 200 millions to a couple of billions. You can just verify big Swedish company now that got a fine because of paying the wrong people money under the table. And of course, it's also your reputation as a company that you're doing business that you shouldn't be doing business with.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. Phil, would you like to add anything? And do you have any examples of companies that have fallen into this?
Yeah, I'll give you one example. I'm not going to obviously name the company, but of one company who do a mixture of automated screening and manual screening, and because they've run a very lean operation, they actually are in the situation where rather than stop manufacturing, which in a lean manufacturing environment is obviously not something that you want to do, they will literally chase a lorry across the country before it leaves the country where they're manufacturing to avoid hitting some of these fines that Stefan's talked about. So I think it very much depends on, the type of company, in the case of manufacturing companies, the type of operations that they have as well. And also, I think the other important point is, as we sort of alluded to, is in terms of both end use of the product, but also who the end user is. So because it goes through 17 different parties, it's whatever the actual end use of it is. And obviously, if you're trying to export something to somewhere that you shouldn't be, you'll go to great lengths to try and make it less obvious where it's going to end up.
Okay, thank you. Chris, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think the key thing really is that that screening isn't an option or like an extra safeguard. Businesses are obligated to conduct the screening. They're obligated to classify their products or technologies. And they're also, just as importantly, obligated to maintain accurate and complete records of the transactions and the actions they take against them. So, for example, if your screening does generate an alert, and then is investigated by your compliance officer, even if that turns out to be a false positive, you really need to make sure you have a full audit trail so that you've got defensible due diligence. And that falls right into what Stefan and Phil were saying, where it's not just enough to do the screening or to kind of protect yourself by having some insurance money tucked away just in case you get caught up in a fine. You have to be able to defend your position and be able to show that you've done the screening and that it came back with came back with a positive or a negative. And then further down the line, if that then turned out to be incorrect, you've at least be able to defend your position. And criminal penalties, as Stefan said, they can be substantial. I mean, I did a little bit of research, and I think we can name these companies because it's in the public domain. So, kind of some firms that have paid over kind of around $1 billion each include some UniCredit Bank, Société Générale, Crédit Agricole. So some of these companies have been really caught up in some of these situations. And I think by naming those companies, you also realize some of the other things that Stefan was talking about, that we're not just talking about physical items here. There's all sorts of financial transactions. There's kind of digital transactions. There's much more to it than really meets the eye at first glance. I guess the misconception. Sorry, Stefan, go ahead.
Just to break in there a little bit, because I think from this perspective also you need to verify your domestic trades also, because we always discuss import and export. Those are easy ones, but what if I ship domestically? Is the receiver domestically Russian embassy and I'm shipping computers there? Can I do that? That's also a thing that you need to look into. So it's not only what I call international business, it's also domestic businesses or EU businesses that you need to verify around this, because who are you shipping to? That's the most important one.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, Rick. I think that ties in with your question around what are some of the misconceptions, and that's a classic one almost. That you only have to worry about it if you're exporting internationally or importing from internationally. And some of the other ones, the typical ones we come across is the restricted parting maybe isn't necessary because you perhaps don't think that you deal with sensitive or controlled products, or that you only have to do it once. Stefan mentioned that as well, that you kind of screen them at the first time you dealt with that customer. They were perfectly clear at that point. But then you don't go back and retrospectively screen them on a regular basis to make sure nothing has changed. And also, I guess that it's full. There's this misconception that screening is completely foolproof, and that ties back into what I was talking about in terms of being able to have that defensible due diligence. So sometimes something will slip through the net. Sometimes you will send something from somewhere where you shouldn't. But if you can show that you follow the process and you did do the screening, then that helps significantly. But it also should become part of an overall comprehensive compliance program, which includes risk assessment, regular monitoring, and all that kind of stuff.
So this really covers manufacturers, distributors, importers, exporters. Does it cover retailers?
Yes.
Do they need to screen as well?
Yeah. I mean, companies within the retail industry doesn't think of it that way, but I would say that everybody who is selling something or doing something around that should have this on their radar in their organization, because it's so important today for that. And there are new things coming into that also, like Child Labor Act and etc., which, for instance, goes into textiles, and that is retailing in its essence. So we talk about ESG's lists now that are focusing on that area, which is coming up to from an EU legislation perspective and from a US legislation perspective, looking into that. And that in US they even stops all the goods on the border until you can prove that you haven't used child labor for the production of it. Or political areas like in China.
Okay, great. Okay, gentlemen, this has been a great panel, great conversation. I'd like to get some closing thoughts from everybody, and we'll start with you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. So when we've talked about the speed of change as relates to compliance, and as the sanctions and embargoes kind of mean doing business with or preventing you doing business with regions or countries are restricted. The flip side of that coin, if I can put it that way, is that it's going to open up trading with other countries and other regions. So if you think that as trade between EU and Russia declines, Russia is looking to trade elsewhere, but equally Western Europe needs to trade elsewhere. So that trade lane between Russia and Europe is kind of closed. So that means that as you start to look for other markets, other vendors, other ways to do business, and you start looking maybe from a European perspective at Latin America, then you also then have to take into account that different restrictions apply. So you have to be able to very quickly kind of swivel and be able to start screening companies, parties, checking your items for shipping to and from Latin America. And then from a Russian perspective, if you're a Chinese or an Indian company, and maybe you're starting to see more trade on that front, that might apply too. So it's really just about, I guess my final thought is trying to put yourself in a position where you can react quickly to changes, where you've got a process in place where it doesn't become like a bottleneck to your supply chain.
Okay, thank you. Stefan, your closing thoughts.
Well, one topic that we haven't touched a little bit, but it's a closing mark in here, that if you work manually today, you have a lot of manual work to find out all the lists and the information in gathering that. And you need to secure that you have up-to-date data in your systems today to verify that it is up to date. It's not one off list, it's updating itself. And you need to keep that into consideration when you look at the data sets you have in your system, that they are not bought once, but they are updating itself into your system and verifying that. And I think that is very crucial for your organization. And then, of course, screen whatever you can and verify your trade in a good, comprehensive way, and deep dive where you need to do that, so you can show your process of proof that you're doing the right trade with it.
Okay, excellent. Phil, your closing remarks.
Yeah, I suppose building on both what Stefan and Chris have said, it is a very dynamic situation. These lists are changing all the time, especially if you look at it on a global basis. So making sure you're following sensible procedures around it and getting the right solutions in place, and taking out some of that manual effort that you'd otherwise be incurring.
Okay, great. So, Chris, this has been an incredible conversation with our panelists, and I want to thank the panelists for joining us today. Tell us how NMB can help customers and partners in the Microsoft ERP world really understand and work with restricted party screening.
Thanks, Rick. So NMB Solutions overall provides supply chain, transportation and compliance solutions specifically for the Dynamics 365 Finance and Supply Chain ERP. And we're part of the ISV Connect program within that. So if you focus specifically on our gateway for restricted party screening, what that does is extend upon the standard D365 F&SCM modules. So companies can then do that screening and manage that compliance within the system. So our real key tenets, if you like, are providing a native D365 experience. So it provides real-time screening or all batch screening within the application itself. So you're not having to jump out and go to different applications. But to do this, we have to partner with providers of the technology. So we partner with two of the market leaders in this space, E2Open, which is where Stefan is from, and Descartes. And we have off-the-shelf API-based integration to both of those, so they can take the responsibility for the kind of the screening process in the background. So that really means that from a user perspective, whether it's you're a finance and supply chain user, you're a partner, what you're facilitating is the ability to create and maintain your approved and denied lists in the application, but also do that real-time screening, and also keep a comprehensive log for audit tracking, approval history, all those things we talked about, but see them natively within D365. And finally, I think it's really important, and it's come out as part of this conversation anyway, to recognize that every supply chain operation is different and has different touch points and nuances. And what we're really trying to do through our solution is provide a kind of comprehensive and configurable like screening process to allow customers to choose how that best fits into their business.
So I want to thank everybody for joining us on this presentation around compliance and supply chain. And I want to thank our panelists for a great conversation. If you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A box. And if you want to reach out to NMB Solutions, here's their numbers and their emails and their QR code. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I hope you enjoyed our presentation.